Today, super excited to have this team. A couple of housekeeping items to start with. We'll have 3 breakout sections of this presentation, and after each section, we'll do a short Q&A, and then we'll do a larger Q&A at the very end. If you have any questions during the session, don't hesitate to put them into the chat, and we'll get to it at the end of each portion. If there's anything else that you're looking to get more information on, or if you're wanting a copy of this presentation, we can certainly send that out. We are recording this presentation and we'll send a version of the deck as well if you need that, so don't hesitate to reach out to me. So without further ado, I'm going to talk through the agenda of our session. Super excited with this session too, because no matter where you are in the process of implementing TAP or working with TAP, whether or not you're new to TAP or a seasoned user, there will be something in this session for you. We have 3 sections based off the life cycle of building a workflow. We'll start up front with process optimization. Which workflows, which use cases should you start with? What processes are good for TAP? We'll move into build tips and tricks. So there's a lot of different unique things you can do with TAP, and we'll be learning from a seasoned user who has learned a lot of these tips and tricks that can help make your build more efficient and your work with TAP more efficient. And then last but not least, we'll learn more about adoption and some launch considerations, and also the design of the workflow, taking adoption into consideration. So without further ado, I will introduce our panel. So first and foremost, we have Dwayne Fisher. It comes to us from Lutron Electronics. He will be talking about the process optimization. Dwayne has a ton of expertise in this section, and he'll talk a little bit more about his background as well. But definitely excited to have him on our panel today. Kenneth Trin, who comes to us from Gilead, will be covering the build tips and tricks. Kenneth has a ton of experience in building, and I myself have learned some tips and tricks from him, so super excited to have him. And then Yuka Zavaras, I always say your name wrong, Yuka. Yuka Zavaras, there we go, coming to us from Electronic Arts, will be talking to us a little bit about EA and how they've taken into consideration their adoption and their launch and how they've designed workflows in different ways, thinking about the user base that will be using them. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right, thank you. So hello everybody, welcome. A little bit about me before we get started here. Lutron Electronics, for those of you who don't know, we're actually the leader in lighting control systems. We're a global manufacturer, and I'd like to say that anybody who has a light switch is a potential customer. So pretty big addressable market for us. For myself, my name is Dwayne Fisher. I've been in IT for 25 years. I've done, I gotta say, almost every job there is to do in IT. I'm a certified Scrum Master. I'm a safe process engineer. Also Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, and I teach Lean Six Sigma for Villanova University. So, so what I want to start with, if you could go to the next slide, is how we look at the TAP tool and how we address process automation. The first thing that we always start off with is trying to understand, where does the value come from, right? So we have to start by understanding, for this particular process, who's the customer, what's important to them, do we have metrics that we want to drive improvements on, who works the process, right? A lot of times when we first look to automate something, there might be multiple teams involved, right? So our definition of value is right out of the Lean Six Sigma handbook here. In order for something to be a value-added step, it has to be an activity the customer is willing to pay for. It has to change the product or service in some way, shape, or form. And it has to be done right the first time. If it doesn't check all 3 of those boxes, then it's not value, it's waste. And specifically, even though there's 3 kinds of wastes, we're really going to focus on the MUDA form of waste, which is most appropriate for processes. All right, next slide. So this is a pretty popular structure. The acronym here is downtime. These are the different forms of waste that are embedded in most processes. And you know, when you look across processes, it's not uncommon to see only about a 2 to 5% value added steps, right? Most of what's in the process is actually waste, right? So when we look at a process, we're always looking to see, does the process work all the time or does it produce defects, right? So anytime we have to rework something or resubmit information, um, do we have to wait, right? That's a major thing the TAP can help us with. If we're sending emails and we're waiting for replies or things like that, that's a major form of waste the TAP can help us with. Um, Non-utilized talent, I say that that's, you know, when people, that's the kind of waste that hides in plain sight, right? If we have really sophisticated engineers and we like to have them, you know, working on their benches and coming up with great ideas for new products, but they're too busy doing paperwork or shuffling emails around, right? Then we're not utilizing our full workforce. So that's another way that TAP really helps us get value for the bottom line, right? Now, transportation, not really applicable to processes, but something that's very close to it is actually motion. So anytime there's unnecessary movement, um, you know, in a physical environment, that could be you're walking to the printer or something like that. But in a virtual environment, if you have to switch between your ERP system and then your email system, and then you have to go to a website, right? Every time you switch back and forth between an application, that we consider that motion. So we pay particular attention to that. And again, that's another area where TAP can really kind of smooth the ride for everybody by being that major interface that drives all of that data collection, right? And then the last one that really applies to processes a lot is extra processing. And we all know what this is, right? It feels like bureaucracy. It feels like, you know, you're filling out a tax form. It just generally, most people will point to it and say, why the heck am I doing this, right? So by starting with that first question, saying, asking ourselves, okay, who's the customer of this? What's important to the customer? Um, and understanding, you know, the concept of value versus waste, we can then go into kind of the mechanics of how do we drive process improvement. So if you go to the next slide, most of the time, we can attack process improvement by doing a simple process map. Now, again, a lot of our processes, they cross multiple teams. And one thing I found in my 8 years of doing Lean Six Sigma is most people know what happens on their team and in their job, but they don't really understand the end-to-end value chain. So when you get the team together, and you map out the process, there's always learning. People are always learning and walking away with good ideas, right? Now, in this COVID environment, right, we obviously can't get together to collaborate. So full disclosure, we use a product called Miro to do our whiteboarding. And that it's an online tool that allows everybody to participate and create stickies and move things around. So we're still able to do our process mapping, and of all the problem solving techniques that we use, this is by far our most popular one. And we don't want it to be complicated. So the first thing we do is we have to understand where the process starts and stops first, right? Every process has got a trigger that wakes it up and makes it happen, and every process has got a final deliverable that the customer consumes, right? So once we understand those scope boundaries, then we can start figuring out, okay, so who works the process, and who do we need to invite to the session, right? Once we do that, we kick off the swim lane by just brainstorming the functions that touch it, right? In this very simple example here, we have a student registration process. So the people who are participating are, we got a student, we got administration, we got the registrar, and then finally, we have a faculty advisor who's doing the final step, right? And I always like to reserve that bottom line for the systems. Remember, we're also looking for unnecessary motion here. So if we're task switching between a lot of applications, that's a big red flag, right? Every time we do a handoff like that, that's a opportunity to create an error, right? Now, the swim lane is my preferred structure. Not a big fan of flowcharts because flowcharts, even though lots of people like to do them, they tend to go in circles. They double back on themselves. Like they're, my experience, they're very hard to read when they get to any level of complexity, right? So swim lane is my preferred technique here because as you move from left to right, there's an indication of time. Okay, so that application, that check to see if the application complete, I can see in the swim lane, that happens before there's the check for whether the minimum standard was met, right? And so as we move left to right, there's a denotion of time. So only things that are done at exactly the same time are plotted on top of each other, right? But aside from that general structure, we keep it pretty easy. If it's a box, it's a task. If it's a diamond, it's a decision, right? And wherever possible, we want our participants to give us data, right? So if we have a diamond and we're making a decision, I always ask them, hey, what percent goes this way versus yes versus no, right? And it doesn't have to be overly scientific, but it gives you an idea of, what's your happy path, percentage. When you get to the end there, you can kind of calculate that, right? The other advantage of having that row on the bottom is it keeps you from trying to add too much detail to the swim lane. So I see people all the time trying to put too many words in those little tiny boxes and diamonds, right? So where we have the minimum standards met, we don't have to document what they are. We just have to, at the bottom, we put the standard operating procedure where all that detail lives so that anybody reading this can easily see, oh, the detail for that is in this standard operating procedure. Let me go look at that detail, right? All right. Now, once we've mapped out the process, then we're going to do some brainstorming, right? So I like to do this right on the swim lane. I use different colored stickies so it's easy to see. But if you could go to the next slide, when we brainstorm, the first thing we want to do is brainstorm issues, right? Now, if you want to give them the downtime acronym and use that to trigger their thinking, that's fine. But most people don't have any problem telling you what they don't like about a process. So I always like to just capture it in their own words and just get it up there, right? And we're going to get so much feedback because this is brainstorming. So we don't want to edit anything. We want free flow of ideas. We want to just keep cranking out those ideas until we run out of steam. So then what we need to do is prioritize them. Now, again, if you're using a virtual whiteboard, I just have people drag the stickies around on their own, right? I don't overly script that, right? But a couple tips for you if you're facilitating something like that. The first tip is they're really faint, but always number your quadrants. Okay, you never want, because you want a lot of stuff in the brainstorming, and you don't want to spend a lot of time saying, "Oh, I think that's high impact happens often," right? That's a lot of words if you have a lot of stickies to get through, right? You want them to be able to say, "I think it's a 1, I think it's a 4," right? Also, before you get started on prioritizing, using this 2x2, get the team to agree on what those lines represent, right? So in this 2x2, we're prioritizing based on the waste frequency. So um, how often does the thing happen, right? And then severity or the impact when it happens, how big a deal is it, right? And so if you can get them to say, hey, what's frequent? More than once an hour, more than once a day, right? Then during the brainstorming, it gets really easy to say, to split, if they're hemming and hawing between, is it a 1 or a 2? You just go, is it more than a day? Fine, then it's over here. So it helps get through those prioritizations quickly, right? Now, you also might run into a situation where you got way too much stuff in the first quadrant, right? Everything is the biggest priority. And if everything's priority number 1, there is no priority, right? So another technique that you can use is dot voting. Very simple if you're in a physical environment. Most of the whiteboard tools have this built in, right? I always give each person the same number of dots, and I make jokes about you can't trade your dots or sell your dots or barter your dots, right? You got to use your own. And also I like to restrict them so that they have to use all their dots and they can't load up, right? So they can't pick one issue and just put all 5 of their dots on that one. They have to spread them around. But that's a pretty common technique that we use all the time. So once we're done here, then we've got the top issues that happen the most often, and when they happen, they have the biggest impact. So we're narrowing our scope of what are we going to go after here, right? So you go to the next slide. So the next thing we need to do is we need to brainstorm and prioritize those solutions. So same thing, we want the normal brainstorming, free flow of ideas, that's all great. We're gonna use a slightly different 2x2 to prioritize them. Um, but before we get to that, because brainstorming and when we brainstorm solutions, we don't want to challenge anybody. We want the free flow. We want a big pile of potential solutions. I like to use a three-phase screening process, right? So the first question I asked the group, and again, I just asked them to self-regulate. I put this on the whiteboard and I say, okay, look, if you put a sticky up there for a solution, ask yourself, does it check all three of these boxes? Does it prevent reoccurrence? Is it something we can control, right? Or is it like, weather or humidity or something crazy we can't control? And does it meet the goals and objectives without kind of violating any restrictions our customer might have or causing other problems, right? And once they go through there, then what you generally see is there's a number of them that kind of stay up there on the swim lane, and then a bunch of them will float down to the next area, right? And then the next level of screening, I asked them to put their stickies on the mistake proofing chart in number 2. Now this is also called Pokeyoke for folks who might be familiar with that term, but this is just simply a 10-point scale that shows us the strength of the solution, right? So if you want to know why people hate meetings, look at the bottom of the scale. That's why, right? Because sharing information, which is mostly what a meeting is, or sharing standards, very ineffective control, extremely ineffective. It's a 0, it's a 1, right? The top is what we really want. We want to find things that we don't really have to do anymore, right? And that could be because we're going to an automated solution. We can have TAP check a value. We don't have to have a person signing it because we've mistake proofed it. We've eliminated that inspection step altogether. And so we can make the process more efficient, right? And once they put them on here, nothing gets eliminated, but they start to see, oh, well, 2 solutions that are going after the similar issue, right? If I have one solution that's an 8 and one solution that's a 1, it's pretty easy for them to realize, well, we should probably move the 8 forward and leave the 1 behind, right? So once we screen that, then again, I have them self-police. I have them move it to the 2x2 matrix. And again, this one's pretty simple. This is based on the efficiency. You could also think of it as the cost, right? Is it cheap and easy to do, or is it expensive and hard to do, right? And the effectiveness. So how completely does it solve the issue? Okay, 50% or nope, it's going to totally eliminate it, right? Um, and again, negotiating what those lines are from the beginning, really good idea. And if you don't do that, here's what I see happen all the time for people who don't take that piece of advice. We get about 3 to 5 into the prioritization, and somebody in the room says, well, hang on, if that's a 2, then this one can't be a 3, and then the wheels come off the cart and you end up taking everything off and starting all over again, right? So please take my advice, get the team to agree on those lines before you get started, right? All right, and then once we have the solutions, then the very last part is we put together a very simple action plan. Okay, this does not have to be a big Gantt chart or a big complicated project, right? But remember, when we develop an automated workflow, we first attack the process. We want the process to be leaned out, to be efficient, to eliminate defects before we try to automate it, right? So we work to simplify the process first, and then basically what we're doing is we're using TAP to automate the future state that we've identified, right? So that tends to be the sequence of of how we do things. Also, from back at the beginning of the discussion, we asked the customer what was important to them. Hopefully those are things that we can measure, but time, cost, and quality are the three buckets that most things will fall into, right? So if you ask the customer, hey, in dimensions of time, cost, and quality, what's important to you? Are we capturing that today? And again, this is another area where TAP really helps because, kind of built into the tool is the ability to count how many of those did we do last week? What was the average time it took to do them, right? How long did we spend in this phase versus this phase, right? All that stuff is built right into the tool. So the data we get once it's automated is incredibly useful for future continuous improvement projects and efforts. All right. So that's it. That's it for the slides. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't see any in the chat right now. If we have any more questions as you guys are thinking through what Dwayne just talked about, please enter them into the chat and we can wrap back around to those at the end of the presentation. There's a lot of good information that Dwayne just gave to us. I know sometimes it takes a while to soak in.
I think the main, if there's one slogan that I probably repeat too often to folks, it's that automating a bad process just gets you defects faster, right? So that's really why we choose to do the path that we just went through.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Dwayne. Teddy, will you take us through build tips and tricks?
Yeah, of course. So hey everyone, I'm Kenny Tran. I work for Gilead Sciences. If you don't know Gilead Sciences, we were in the news recently for Remdesivir. But anyways, I've been at Gilead for approximately a little over 3 years, and we've been using TAP for about a little over 2 years. And along the way, we've learned a lot of tips and cool tricks and things like that. And I kind of want to share some top tips and tricks today. But before we get into that, just kind of how is Gilead Sciences using TAP? One of the biggest things that we use it for is contract automation. We actually call it GCAT. We also use it for a wide range of other intake type of requests, such as headcount requests, ask the librarian. This is mainly for if users have questions for the contract repository. Then we even have it for kind of a protocol distribution to teams where they will come back and acknowledge. But the real use case that we'll look at today is our contract automation tool. And this workflow is by far our biggest workflow. And we're integrated with Salesforce in this. And we learned a lot of cool things on the way. Although I can't share with you everything, here are some of the highlights that I will share. So we'll talk about formula fields, how to use that, using a loading page for your TAP form, utilizing URL parameters, some tricks around Salesforce keys, and then we'll look at some debugging tips and tricks, so like view conditions, finding fields, and then also how to use your browser's developer tool, inspect element, to kind of hide and show some features. So the first thing I want to jump into is the formula fields. So if you worked with TAP, you know that conditions drive a lot of things, the hide and show features, and you know conditions can get sometimes long and complex, and then maintaining them can also be a pain, especially if you need to add a condition in the middle, you might have to redo the whole condition. Well, so one thing that we found that works well is using text fields and then using the formula option to actually put the conditions in the formula. And then what happens is then your text field then returns either true or false, or in our case, it's either pass or fail. And I'm going to show you guys a quick example of that. So here is our GCAT page, or our contract automation. They come here and they request a new agreement, and it goes through the system. So if you request an MSA, or a master services agreement, legal wanted to put these set of screening questions here that really dictate if the user's in the right place. So the user would come in, usually answer no to everything, and then the rest of the form will show up. So if you worked with TAP and you built some TAP forms, you know that in order to do this, you actually have to put these 4 conditions in every single one of these show fields. right? And that could be cumbersome as it increases, and it just grows exponentially. So what we did was we used a formula field, and you can see here we called it MSA gateway status. This is just a text field, and on the side here you have these additional settings. You can click on formula, and you can actually put in some formulas here. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. Just if they answer yes to any of those, then we're going to return fail. If they answer no to all of those, then we'll go ahead and return a pass. And where this really shines is now you can put this text field as a condition, and you can see here with this view conditions how many conditions this one field relies on. So you can see there's like over 20 different conditions here that run off of that that formula field. And if I click on one, you can see what I mean when I say it can get quite cumbersome. So here, this is just as simple as just adding MSA gateway status equals pass, and I save myself adding those 4 or 5 different conditions in each one of those. And the biggest benefit that we saw is, let's say the business comes back to me and says, hey, Kenny, I want you to add another question in between these two and match the same conditions. Well, with the formula field, I can easily just come into this formula, change it in the formula, and it'll propagate against all the other conditions. So I only have to change it one time in this actual formula field. So it definitely saves a bunch of time, and I would highly recommend you use that if you can. So the next tip here is, along with a lot of conditions, and you can see there was a lot of conditions in my form. Sometimes having too many things running in the background, when the user loads the page, things might take a while to load and fields might take a while to disappear. So this actually gives you a bad kind of a user experience. So what we had a tip is using a loading page. And this is actually really simple with an HTML element field. And you can basically take over the whole screen and show a loading page. So for example, here, if we go back to the same workflow, if we refresh this page, you get a loading screen that pops up, takes up the entire screen, waits for the page to load, and then it'll disappear and it'll show you exactly what you want. And I'll give you the quick example of a no loading page with a lot of conditions. You're going to see a lot of these fields pop up, and then after a while, they'll disappear. As a user, you might be wondering, oh, maybe that's a bug. Maybe I shouldn't be seeing that or something like that. So you'll report that. So it's a good idea to have a loading page if it does take a while. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just an HTML field and then some simple CSS on there. And then you can have your loading page pop up and then have a condition to make it disappear afterwards. So another cool tip that we have is that sometimes maybe the user is coming from an intranet site or something like that, and you want to pre-populate your form with some fields. Well, Tap gives you this great feature where you can actually pass some of the information through the URL. So if you see here at the bottom, element 999, we're going to pass over request, and element 100 CDA. We call it a CDA. You guys might call it an NDA. But if I click on this, you'll see that same form pre-populated with some information. So you'll see the first question will populate with the request already selected, and then you'll see that the second one will already select the confidential disclosure agreement, and it'll be ready to go for the user. So you can definitely use this if you know they need to be pre-populated, or you want to pre-populate some dropdowns and things like that. You can have it auto-selected for the user already. So that's really cool. With this workflow, we are working with multiple Salesforce instances. And if you work with Salesforce in your IT infrastructure, you probably know that Salesforce has a lot of different sandboxes, and your IT team probably has like a UAT environment, demo environment, production. So one thing that we found is that we have to duplicate our workflows for each environment because they want to adequately test in every single environment. And one quick and easy way that we found to change it is to export your workflow and re-import that. And then Tap actually gives you a great option to change your Salesforce keys. So I'm just exporting here and then importing that same workflow. And you can see once it pops up that I can change it at the bottom. So here I'm going to go ahead and select the Interact demo. And then if we scroll down to the bottom, my Salesforce key is currently selected to UAT, but I can easily change it to demo, and then because the way Tap's import feature works is then it's going to change it to point to the right keys, and then you saved yourself a bunch of time even if you have to recreate them. So that's what we did for the multiple Salesforce environments. So those are kind of the build tips. There's a couple debugging and troubleshooting. So maybe you come back to your workflow and you need some help doing certain things. One great feature that we use quite often ever since they added it was the view conditions. And you saw a little bit of how that worked earlier with the function here. So if you go into this and you can click the view conditions, what's great about this is that you can see all the conditions that that field particularly relies on. And you can even come here and you can see exactly which one is the show condition. So let's say you wanted to add this field underneath it to it. You can easily just access the view conditions from here, even go into your conditions and add that field underneath, and it'll follow the same thing. So that's a really useful feature, and I'm really happy that they implemented that. So this next one here, sometimes you might get an instance where you build a great workflow and then it's working great for about 2 months or something like that. And then the business comes back to you and says, hey, I want to change the obligations field. I want to change the text. Can you do that? So a lot of the times if you go into your workflow, you might have a hard time finding that actual field. And you can see I have a lot of different sections here and a lot of different fields. So what we found for you to quickly find your field is you can go to the styles tab over here. This actually just shows you all the form elements, and you can go ahead and type what you're looking for here. So obligations, and you can see here, does Gilead have any obligations, is under the services non-HCP consultancy section. But if I click on it, it actually Tap automatically moves me to that section with that with that field, and I can go in there and make the edits that I need to. So that's really a lifesaver if you're looking for your field. And then the last debugging kind of tip that I have is using your browser's developer tools or inspect element. Sometimes you want to force a field to show or something like that. Maybe you're just debugging it or troubleshooting it. And I'll show you a great example of that use case that we had at the very beginning, where if I'm looking at a master services agreement, there's those four questions here. If I answer no, 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 and remember I told you there's a hidden formula field. So if you right click and you click inspect, this should bring up your developer tools. This is just built into most all browsers. And if you control F and you find your form element, so mine's 558, and you can see here on the right hand side, this is the CSS that goes with it. So display none is just basically hiding the form field. So if I uncheck that, you can actually see the field pops up here. And then, so if I finish this and I click no for all of them, you can see it says pass. And then if I click yes, you can see that it says fail. So it's really cool. You can see it, troubleshoot it right away. And if you're working with a lot of CSS and you're doing your styling sheets, this is also a good tool for on the fly edits if you want to see what it might potentially look like. So for example, this background, let's say I want to change the color and show the client, oh, what does it look like if it's blue, if it's this color or black or something like that. So it's really cool, really helpful if you're using CSS and you want to troubleshoot that as well. So I think those are all the big highlight tips that I have to share. I guess next up is Yuka, but maybe if there's any questions, Melissa.
Any questions? I don't see any in the chat right now. I'll give everyone just a couple of seconds to type in their question.
Cool, easy.
You explained everything.
Well, I don't have a question for Kenny, but I just wanted to share with the team that I've been working with TAP for 5 years, and some of the things that he shared with you today is going to help you so much in saving time. I wish I had known about this like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So thank you, Kenny, for sharing.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Kenny. You did. I know we're all super excited about adoption and launch. Will you take us through some of the things that EA is doing and what you
Sure.
consider when you are planning for adoption?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Yuka at Electronic Arts. I've been working at EA for 18 years. I started when I was probably 5, but I've been using TAP for 5 years, quite a long time. I am not a master black belt like Dwayne, but I do have a brown belt in karate, and I can break boards with my sidekicks. Not that any of my sidekicks help with any of this, but I thought I had to share. I just recently found out that I can actually break boards, so it's pretty exciting for me. I've worked in legal operations for about 11 years, but my first implementation dates back to 2006 with Salesforce. So I have learned some things over the years. So today, I would like to share some of my learnings with you about user adoption specifically and launch considerations. And I'm actually hoping that you will find at least one thing that will be helpful to you or maybe perhaps resonates with you. So here we go. Before I dive into my part of the presentation, I wanted to share with you how we use TAP at EA. We use it in many different ways, but one of the ways we use it is as a wrapper for Adobe Sign. And what that means is we built an e-signature portal. So instead of having our users use Adobe Sign directly, we built a user interface through TAP. And what we did was build in signer lists, authorized signer lists by legal entity. So that's one of the many questions that our users have is, hey, I don't really know who's supposed to sign on behalf of EA. So we built that in with TAP, and TAP is great for that. We also use TAP to empower our business users to self-serve with templated pre-signed contracts like the NDA, publicity rights releases, submission NDAs, and recording exhibits. So what's great about this is for high volume contracts that are relatively simple, that don't necessarily require legal to review, legal actually doesn't need to touch anything. It just goes and off it goes and the business takes care of themselves. It's awesome. Another thing we do with TAP is we built intake workflows so that the business can submit requests for contracts. Very similar to what Kenny showed you earlier today. But what we did was in one of the workflows, we built in the ability for the business to submit a request and for the legal managers to preview or review the request and then assign it to a licensing associate, for example. And the licensing associate, if their plate is full, they can say, no way, I have no time for this. And they can reject it and kicks back to the legal manager and they can reassign it to somebody else and so on and so forth. And we also built in date counters. So meaning we used a lot of formula fields to count the number of days that a request sits at a specific step of the workflow, which is very useful for legal managers and also for the business too, to see how long things are, where things are getting stuck. And then we also built a very complicated contract approval and signature portal. It's basically after the contract request is reviewed by the legal partner, they draft the contract is ready to go. Then they go into this CASP workflow, upload it, and then it can trigger parallel workflows for finance stakeholder review. It can do linear approval workflow. It has a built-in signature capability. And also in this tool too, we also built in a lookup list for authorized approvers and signers. Again, a lot of confusion around who's authorized to sign, who's authorized to approve for a $500 deal, $1,000 deal, $1 million deal. So TAP is, again, great for building those kinds of logic into the tool. And then most recently, we've integrated TAP to our externally facing website. It allows with the integration, it pushes and pulls data between the two systems. I won't bore you with a lot of detail, but basically we pull in the signer information from the website, and it auto-generates the terms and conditions specifically for that signer. They sign it on the fly. And then for the internal business process part, that business user can actually submit a request for a contract template. Legal reviews the template, approves it once, and then that integration then kicks off, and they can then use that template and then send it off to hundreds of signers at a time. So TAP can be very powerful. That last integration, we just launched in May, and it's like the talk of the town around here. And I have a lot of IT folks and a lot of game teams knocking at my door. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention EA makes games. So if I start to interject the word game, it's because we make games. All right, but whatever we automate simple or complex business processes, we try to keep our focus on user experience, and this is why I'm here to talk to you about that. So what is user adoption, right? So we want the users to use the tool. You've gone through Dwayne's process optimization exercise. You came up with a really awesome process. You're using Kenny's tips and tricks and built this awesome tool, right? But what is it all for? It's really for the users to use it. One of the things I've learned is that it doesn't really matter if I, the designer and the architect, love the tool, because I'm not really the intended audience, right? I'm not really the intended end user. So what matters is what the users want, how the users feel about your tool, because ultimately you want them to come back. So I think we spend a lot of our time thinking about, is the workflow and the form design user-friendly? Are the questions intuitive, or is it so complicated that they're just going to keep emailing me all hours of the day to ask me questions? Is the process designed so that it's user-friendly? I think it goes back to Dwayne's acronym. One of the last circles, I think, is about, there's a question in there, is it making it easier or worse for the end user? So you have to think about that too. Automation or solutions don't necessarily make things easier. Sometimes you're imposing process and imposing policies. So you want to do much as you can to make the tool as user-friendly as possible. And while doing that, you want to think about the first-time user. Don't assume everybody knows what they're doing. Don't assume that they've submitted a contract request 1,000 times over before they come to your portal. It might be their first time. Maybe they're a new employee. So design for the novice while designing for the most simplest scenarios and most complex scenarios. But as far as the design goes, I wanted to share with you some of a few screenshots to illustrate what I mean. Kenny, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So if you can see this is our version 1 of our contract request portal. Believe it or not, we put a lot of energy into this design. We thought it was awesome. We launched it, we let the users come, we said, go ahead and use it. This is awesome, it's great. And then the most common feedback we got was, we don't get it. It's really confusing. We're overwhelmed. What are all these things? What are all these checkboxes mean? So then we went back to the drawing board and spent many, many, many more hours and came up with version 2. Kenny, if you don't mind going to the next slide. We added colors, created groupings, and we think that this is more appealing. And so far, we haven't received complaints about this one. And if you go to the next one, Kenny. Now, with this new design, when an employee from corporate functions clicks on a tile, which is that pink one that you see on the screenshot, they now only see 3 options that are relevant for their division, as opposed to all 21. That was overwhelming and confusing for the user. We took it one step further and we rephrased the questions or field labels so that they are more user-friendly. For example, tell us more about your request. Instead of, please select the relevant options from below, right? Which one would you rather use? I think most people would prefer to use the second version, right? At least I hope so, because we spent a lot of time on this. Next slide. All right, so training should be, is another component of user adoption. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. I suggest adjusting training to the scope and the complexity of the business process that your workflow is automating. For example, if you've just launched the NDA portal and it's pretty user intuitive, or maybe you've just launched a design refresh that I just showed you, you probably don't need an announcement. You probably don't need formal training. You just launch, then go, and then answer questions as they come in. On the other hand, though, complex processes may need more. So maybe formal training sessions, maybe even FAQs, a support portal. We actually built one for our contract approvals, contract approval and signature portal, because it's such a complicated process and with a lot of policy enforcements. So we actually built a specific intranet site that houses all the FAQs, video tutorials, and frequent, whatnot, how-to guides, all in this one portal. And maybe complex processes might require executive sponsorship, socialization, et cetera, Really think about the users, how many is in scope, how many are you expecting to use? Are we talking about a handful of people versus thousands? Where are they located? Are they all located in North America, or is it across the globe? What roles do they play? Are they all requesters like the NDA portal, or are they going to be approvers? Are they reviewers? Are they signers? What parts of the process could be confusing to the users, right? Think about those things. And then one of the things I've learned very painfully is that no matter what you do, there's going to be some pushback. So try to anticipate what parts of the organization, who could be pushing back on adoption. So when you take these things into consideration, I think you will naturally adjust your training program and your strategy accordingly. Next slide. Now that the design is done, the tool is live, and the training is completed, now what, right? Maybe some of you are lucky enough to walk away, but what else could be done to keep users coming back to use a tool? I believe user support and change management are critical. So my team supports virtually all solutions we've implemented. If my teammates are on the call, I am so sorry, but yeah, we implement a lot and then we support a lot. We continue. We never get to leave and walk away. So we have worked directly with the end users and have learned that answering questions about the policies and the business processes that the workflow is automating or supporting is just as critical or more so than showing them how to use a tool. Because if you did your design right, I think the tool probably is intuitive enough. And we're finding that our most complicated workflow, the approvals and signature portal, majority of the questions that we receive is, we don't understand the company policy. What is this? Why are you forcing me to route it to FP&A for approval? Why are you forcing it? Why does it have to go to the SVP? Why can't my manager approve? So, so the support team should have a solid understanding of what the tool is automating. And at least for us, that's been working really well. And it keeps the users coming back. And if you're hand-holding them through those kind of questions, they don't mind using the tool so much. But if your team is small like mine, it is great to have regional POCs who can help in the user's time zones. So my team is located in North America. So obviously we're kind of sleeping when the APAC team is up and running and have questions. One of my teammates is awesome. She actually checks emails at 1 in the morning sometimes. They're super appreciative of her. But if you don't have someone who's willing to get up at 1 in the morning, or you only have a very small team, whenever possible, identify POCs and tag team with them so that they can be available to answer questions. Because obviously the business is always, it's critical, my question is really urgent, I need I need to know right now. So it's great to have a body available to fill these questions on the fly. Support comes in many forms. For some complicated business critical processes, the core project team, we have a core project team, not on all projects, but we retained a core project team that meets on a monthly basis. We talk about how is adoption going? Do we need to do any more training? What's the feedback? We actually go out and collect feedback regularly and then talk about what are the changes we need to make to the tool to make users happy. So we release updates on a regular basis to keep up with the ever-changing business needs. And I think if you're a Mutual customer, you know that TAP, they do that for TAP as well. I'm a very demanding customer of TAP, and I demand changes all the time. Hey, you know what? My business wants me to do this. I don't know how to do this in TAP. I don't think it can do it. I need this feature. Come on, guys, release something. Give me a functionality, right? Because Kenny's tips and tricks isn't working right now. I need something else. So I'm very demanding. So as my users are demanding to me, as I'm demanding to Mutual Tech, when my customers ask for stuff, we try to deliver. So if you focus on user friendliness and meeting the demands of your users, I think you will have adoption. And bottom line is keep users coming back.
Fantastic. Thanks, Yuka. Get those questions in. Anissa, do you have any questions on your end?
Sorry, yes. So we have one for Yuka, and it's around the CASP workflow. And the question is that, it handles a lot of different stakeholders and perhaps even tasks. So they're wondering the question is, so I'm wondering when EA decides that a workflow should end, start a parallel workflow, child workflow, etc. Or in other words, how do you know when the workflow is too big or how to break that up?
There's really no one answer, one right answer. I hate saying this, but it's true. It really depends on your business process, your end user's experience, and what it looks like on the dashboard. So CASP is huge. It just looks like a big old spaghetti bowl when you look at the diagram. So at this point, I don't think we can add any more processes or steps. So it really depends. So if it's a parent process kicking off a sub process or related process, like contract workflow could trigger a supplier process, for example. I think a parent-child makes sense. But it really, for us, the determining factor is, can we fit any more in there while maintaining the testing? Well, how can I say this? The more steps you add, the more complicated and more painful the testing becomes. So when you add an example, in Kenny's example, he added a question in between the three options or three questions. In the CASP process, when you do that, you have like hundreds of scenarios to test through. So that becomes painful. So that when you hit that part, you need to start creating sub-processes outside of the CASP workflow or your current workflow. But it really just depends on the workflow, and then again, the user experience and the experience for the administrators. Sorry, I don't really have like, yeah, do it when you hit this point. It's not like that. It really does depend. But I'd be happy to, if you want to reach out and chat separately, I'd be happy to continue our discussion.
Any other questions, Anissa, that you see on your end?
We could end with one more, and this is for everyone, and I think it's probably a good one to just end on. So, of course, not every, workflow is really fast into production. But from all of your work that everyone has done here, what's the fastest workflow that you guys have been able to get into production?
7 days. That didn't really answer what workflow. But it was a submission NDA. It was actually my very first workflow that I implemented in TAP. And I had just learned how to configure in TAP like 3 days prior. So, but I configured it in 7 days. If I can do it, anyone can do it. Right, Kenny?
Ours is a little bit longer, probably 2 weeks.
But that's really short.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think for us, not to try to, but I think for us, when the stars align and everyone's approval is in the right place, we were able to get something out within 3 days. And this is very early on. It's just a really simple process of just getting authorization for a form instead of sending that out. But something like that, when the stars align, we were able to develop it, test it, and get it out within a couple of days.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you all so much for presenting today. A lot of valuable information. I see everyone in happy hour then, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions directly to MetroTech moderators or even the clients, and then the Co-Innovation Forum too is a great place to reach out to the community. Thank you so much.